We are going to, let's see, we've got a session called How MLSs Can Help Brokers Make Better Decisions Using Data. That's a long title. I'd like to introduce Eric Stegemann, who is the CEO of TRIBUS. I'm sure many of you already know Eric, but fun fact, Eric actually got his start here in St. Louis, right? Eric started off in, 2004, created River City Real Estate, which quickly became one of the largest, or the largest independent brokerage in St. Louis, which is pretty amazing. From there, he oversaw the development of a set of real estate technology that eventually became TRIBUS. And now TRIBUS is focused on helping small, mid-sized, larger brokerages around the US and Canada with their needs for developing technology, websites, and all kinds of other wonderful stuff. So, Eric, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Scott. Where's the applause? Everybody was out drinking at the Zilla party too late. It's muted. Okay, so as Scott said, I do come from the brokerage world, so I previously did sell real estate. I literally put signs in yards, and I managed a brokerage company. We had about 130 agents. And it seems like here in 2019, I'm still banging the same drum that I banged in the early 2000s as far as getting data. And so I actually asked to change the title, which is what Scott read as the title. I asked to change it a little bit because the original title, I think, said how brokerages can use data to make better decisions. And let's face it, there unfortunately is not enough brokers in this room, which I know Sam is doing a good job trying to change, and I'm banging the drum right behind you. Okay. But you know what I want to do for the MLS folks in the room, I think this is more centered a little bit around you and to explain what brokers can do with the data once you empower them to do it. Because what we found is a lot of the rules around vendors like TRIBUS getting access to the data are steeped in the idea that we're just IDX vendors for the most part. And in actuality, you know, many brokerage companies, brokerage software companies are so much more and provide so much more value than just an agent having a framed-in IDX product on their website. And so what I'm going to do is try to give you some examples where we've worked with MLSs around the country to get more data and how we've empowered brokerages using that data to make better decisions. So I want to start out for just a second. So you know, what I also find in talking to a lot of MLS folks is they don't necessarily, they understand the MLS world really, really, really well, but they don't necessarily understand how we got to where we're at in terms of the brokerage world, where we sit today. So does anybody know actually how the founding of NAR / how organized real estate came to be? Go ahead.
So it didn't start out as a men-only organization, but it was for integrity, like for the integrity of the industry and of the profession.
That's absolutely right. She said it was started to bring more integrity to the profession. So where a lot of this came up from was the great San Francisco earthquake in the early 1900s. And what happened after the earthquake was a whole bunch of brokerages, or excuse me, real estate people, and let's face it, back then, real estate men back then, were outside in San Francisco. And what happened is all these homes kind of crumbled to the ground. And when those homes crumbled to the ground, they just went along and said, now I have the right to sell this property, because the person who actually owned the property wasn't there, because obviously the place was in rubble. And so they were selling things that they didn't have the right to sell. And so this massive problem came out. It was this huge PR problem that nobody trusted a real estate agent to help them transact in real estate anymore. And so the what became the National Association of Realtors, and originally Cole Banker was Mr. Cole and Mr. Banker got together and said, let's do some better stuff here. And so back then, and all the way through really the 70s, real estate was your full-time career, right? So everybody remember Glenn Ross? They're all sitting in the room, they're answering phone calls, that's their job. They're showing up every day, and somebody's yelling at them because they're not doing their job. Let's face it, that's not where we're at today, right? So what happened is, you know, in 1970s, and I'm not saying anything bad about RE/MAX or Realty Executives, so please don't take anything that way, but what happened is the power started to shift, right? So you had, back then, before the 70s, all the power was with the brokerages. So the broker, the person in charge said, here's what you're gonna do today, you better go do this, otherwise you're fired, and here's how you're gonna do it. And then in the 70s, RE/MAX, Realty Executives, et cetera, came out, and all that power started to swing back in favor of the agent. And so the agent got to make all their own decisions. Today, we have different models that have come out, but the problem that really came out of this is, I like to say, agents started running amok. So there's a reason why all of your MLSs have all these rules in place as far as display and what can and what can't be done, and in my opinion, this is why that happened. Now, if you've ever seen any agent advertising, this is pretty tame for what comes out there. But if I was a broker, when I was a broker, if something went out, and by the way, this person works for a company, a well-known franchise company, and if you can't read it, his number is 416-PUNCH-ME. And so what happened is you got all this really bad advertising. You got all these agents going and doing everything that they wanted to go do. And I highly encourage you, if you ever want a good laugh, Google bad realtor headshots or bad realtor marketing. That is, if you're having a bad day, I highly encourage this. My personal favorite is probably either Dorita, who has Doritos in all of her advertising, or Brad Lamb, who put his face on the body of a lamb, really bad Photoshop-wise. But highly encourage you for a good laugh. Go ahead and Google that. But this is what ended up happening, right? So agents started going and doing kind of what they wanted to go do. Oversight went to almost zero, and this is how this stuff started happening. And there was the rise of this part-time real estate agent, right? So what happened with a lot of brokerages is they just started saying, well, okay, they're independent contractors. I don't pay them a salary anymore. They just come into the office, and I really have no hard cost to having this person work for me, right? So, the numbers of agents started swelling, and these brokerages started having all these agents, and let's face it, a lot of them don't do business. At one point, my friend Rob Hahn and I looked at all of the numbers for in the entire state of California and found that 61% of all agents in MLSs in California had not sold a property in over a year. And so we started looking into that a little more, and what we realized is that brokers were just making these decisions because it was like, okay, well, there's no cost. Well, I'm here to say there is cost, and I'm going to share with you how you can help brokers understand how to better manage things. I always used to make a joke that if you got a real estate license, you never go hungry again for the rest of your life because there was always a title or mortgage rep willing to buy you donuts, and that's what happened. So brokers started keeping agents at any cost. So this is the other end of that pendulum. So the first end was everybody joined, and I said, okay, well, you got a seat at the table. You can go sell real estate. If you sell something great, I'll make a 50-50 split on you. And if you don't, no big deal. But the other end of that spectrum came, which was, here's all these agents that did lots and lots and lots and lots of business on their own. And all of a sudden, these brokerages had to start paying them higher and higher and higher commission rates to get them to stay, right? Anybody, who's in here from California? Right? Okay. So when I started selling real estate at my brokerage that was here in St. Louis, where I started, my split was 50-50. When I sold, I made almost $100,000 one year selling real estate, and so I bumped my way up, but I still at my best was probably only making about a 70-30 split, right? Now, I know there are plenty of brokerages in California, for those of you that just raise your hand, their splits are 90-10 sometimes to start, right? Now, why did a brokerage do that? Well, this is what happened. It was like, oh, we need agents. We had 1,000 agents before, and we started losing agents, so I guess we better bump up our splits. Well, the truth is, that they just made that decision willy-nilly. Most of them make those decisions willy-nilly. They're not based upon real data. It's all based upon gut reactions. It's a gut reaction to, oh my God, if this agent leaves, I'll lose 300 listings this year. I better keep them. And then their buddy says, oh, well, you gave Eric 90-10 split. You should give me a 90-10 split too, right? So this perpetuation happened because we weren't using data. Another thing that ended up happening with most brokerages, and especially before the downturn, is that brokerages would just start opening offices anywhere their agents really wanted them to open an office, right? So if an agent actually sold some decent amount of real estate, they said, oh, I need an office in downtown Manhattan, and it costs $180 a square foot a year for this space. they would say, okay, well, we're going to lose the agent if we don't have it, so we better go do it. So they would put an office here, an office there, and that's how you ended up with these companies that had 50 offices and had, about 500 square feet per agent with 50 offices. So why did they do that? Well, they just didn't know the data. You ended up with empty offices. Now, to bring back up Rob Hahn, the way I started from this conversation was a conversation that I had with Rob that he presented to NAR almost 10 years ago. In fact, it might be exactly 10 years ago. And he brought up this screen on his laptop, and ever since then, this idea has haunted me that brokerages make decisions by guesswork. They're managing their brokerages by intuition and guesswork and not real data. And I think for those MLSs that are in here, if you went and talked to most of the brokerages that are in your markets, I think you would, if you ask them the questions, why did you offer this split? Why did you open this office? Why do you provide these tools? Their answers will very rarely include any data to back that up. It will almost always be because my agents need it or some other subjective answer. It is very rarely an objective answer. Now, we set out to really understand why that was the case. And what we came to find with TRIBUS was we realized that a lot of them just didn't have good data to make the decisions, or they didn't have good tools to use the data to make the decisions. I'm going to focus on the first part and how MLSs that are sitting here in this room can help brokerages make better decisions by giving them data. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to provide you all some exact examples on what brokerages can do with the data if you open up data sets that you can provide to them. Okay, so the first thing is listings. Now, I ask brokerages this question all the time. So when we go in, at TRIBUS, we like to say we're kind of like the Accenture of real estate. So if you know they're a management consulting firm, they go in, they really learn about the business, and then they make specific recommendations and build software custom to the needs of that brokerage. And so I go in, and one of the things that we ask brokerages all the time is this question, and I encourage you to think about it for your MLS. What is the value of a listing to the broker, the brokerage as a whole? What's the value of that listing? And I mean, I'm not talking about, well, sometimes they're for sale for $500,000 and I'm going to make X number of dollars, or they're for sale for $1 million, so I'm going to make Y amount of dollars. I'm talking about overall and counting every single aspect of that listing. So sometimes that listing is taken and it's overpriced, right? So how many of you know, do anybody of your MLSs know the average, off the top of your head, your average list to sale price? Anybody? Come on, MLS folks, you're the ones with the data. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, but do you guys really know? Like, raise your hand if you know the answer to this question. Okay. Only, I would say, maybe a third, somewhere between a third and a half the room. If you're an MLS person, you probably should know these answers. Just like brokers should know these answers. They don't. But if you take a listing and the listing is, the seller convinced you to take the listing for $600,000 and you know in your heart it's really only worth $500,000, what's the value of that? It's probably negative to your brokerage because you're going to spend a bunch of time, effort, energy, and money marketing that listing. Now, let's say at the opposite end, you get and it sells day one, and you didn't have to do a whole lot of marketing or anything like that. I'm not talking about those outliers. I'm talking about all the data that adds up for all the listings for a brokerage or in your entire MLS. I would say that no one in this room, and probably no brokerage, very few brokerages out there can tell me that the value of a listing to them is X number of dollars in aggregate across their entire business. Now, why is that? A listing is probably one of the most valuable things outside of a contact database and outside of the agents that are doing the business for a brokerage. Those listings are pretty much the most valuable thing that the brokerage has at any given point, because there's so much that can be done with a listing, right? You have a sign in a yard. It's doing free advertising for you at any given point for that brokerage. You have the data on that listing because now as a brokerage, you know this listing sold. It's sold to Jim and Jane, and they bought it for this much money, and they have 2 kids, and their 2 kids are this old, and they might be going to school soon, and they might need to move. And so you know all these things that you can later market to them. So there's value in the data just in taking those listings. But no one really has put together good data to say, hey, a brokerage that gets this listing in this particular market says that it's worth this much money, right? Why? Why? I mean, every other business that's out there, any Fortune 500 company, all of their assets, and I would say listings are definitely assets of a brokerage. And I would suggest for the MLS folks in the room, your listings are assets in your MLS as well. They could say the value of our assets is X, right? Even when it's a abstract item like a listing, where it's not something hard value, where it's a widget that we know the cost is $1 and we sell it for $2 and we still know what the value of that is. But people don't track what the value of listings is to them. And so they can't make decisions like saying, what's the real value of this listing? Should I take it a little bit overpriced because it's valuable to me and let it sit on the market for a little bit longer? Or should I wait and tell the seller no because they want to list it way too high and the value just isn't there for all the work that we'll put into it, right? But if data isn't provided to the brokerages that really gives them the information that they can use from MLSs, and listings is probably, out of everything I'm going to suggest to you today, listings is probably the thing that your MLSs are the most open about, right? That they can figure this out, and it really comes down to the brokerage to do their own metrics to figure out what the value is. But if there's any data set on that listing that could help them, that's what I would encourage you to push through. Showing data. This actually, I added this slide this morning because somebody mentioned it to me yesterday, and I hadn't even thought about it when I was putting together the presentation, is knowing showing data. So how many MLSs in here gather showing data from their lockbox or their showing partnerships? Great, okay, so a chunk of you. Now, is there any of you that just raised your hand, any of you push that data through a feed to brokerages, vendors, et cetera? No, probably, right? And I heard yesterday in the data dictionary work group, this might be added very soon. So I will keep my fingers crossed on that. But think about showing data. Now, showing data goes back to listing data, right? If I know how many people came through the property, I can better value my listings. I can better say listings in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zip code get lots of showings, lots of people see my sign, and I have a 32% chance of my brokerage double ending that deal if we get that sign in that particular zip code because of how well trafficked the area is or how high in demand that is. But right now, very few brokerages I'm aware of get showing data back, right? So what happens is, here's the process of how most showings go today. So some of them go through showing time in your MLS, and they say, I want to go show something. Some of them, showing time just bought CSS last week. So some of them call CSS and say, can you make the appointment? And so those are recording data. But does anybody know in their MLS how many times showings or what percentage of showings are done through showing time or done through something like CSS? Okay, a couple hands raised. That's something I'd look at, right? Because there's data that can be provided there. But what happens a lot of times with showings is an agent just calls the other agent, following the showing instructions that says, call agent for showing, pick up the phone, can I go show the property at 7 o'clock? Let me call my seller. Hang up the phone, call the seller. Can I show the property at 7 o'clock? Yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay, call back the showing agent or the agent that wants to see the property. Yes, you can show it at 7 o'clock. What other information is tracked at that point? There was a showing, it was at 7 o'clock, and the vast majority of that information is now only retained in the realtor's brain. That's all. If they're not using showing time or CSS or any of those other products, that's where it lives. So as MLSs, if you can get the data from services that are out there or provide that as a service, that data is incredibly valuable to you as an MLS and incredibly valuable to the brokerages because now they can start making better decisions about listings because they know who's showing it. It's also a security thing, right? Like this is the thing that I always go back to. To this day, still, most showings are that phone call process. Now, if you're in certain cities, Chicago, San Francisco, certain parts of LA, the listing agent shows up to a lot of the showings that are there. So they're going to know more and they're going to be there. But a lot of them, they're not. I'm from St. Louis. This is where I had my brokerage. No, we never went to one showing. The buyer's agent showed up with their clients. They went to their super lockbox. They clicked the button. They walked in. They looked at the property. And if they didn't fill out a feedback form, all I really knew was that they walked into the property, maybe, if I could get the super sheet to print out for me of whether they were there or not. But I have that data as the agent. I don't have it necessarily the brokerage. So for those of MLSs that have this data, I would highly encourage you, if it gets part of a data dictionary, please pass that data through to a brokerage, because there's all sorts of things that the brokerage can do. They can go back to these listings and understand how many showings it got, how many times the property was viewed, how many times a showing has to happen before the average home sells. That's really interesting data too, right? So as a brokerage, you could say, hey, look, on average, homes in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zip code are shown 4 times beforehand. Now, think about Open Door, folks. Think about how much data could be provided to brokers to help them compete against companies like Open Door or Redfin's offers product or Zillow offers product, whatever they're called. But how much data could be said? Look, you know, a lot of those pitch will take a $40,000 cut in terms of the value of your home, and we'll sell it right now because you don't want to have your kids make their beds every morning. You don't want to have to clean up the house every day. And I'm going to take that cut because the convenience is worth it to me to not worry about that. Well, what if you could tell the seller, hey, look, if you list this home in this particular area, our data shows that you're only going to have to show it 4 times before we're going to get an offer. 4 times to get $40,000, right? That's what that data can provide to a brokerage, and very few, if any, brokerages that I'm aware of are getting that kind of data and knowing that right now. We're actually working with a company in Minneapolis, Remax Results, to get this data right now from showing time to start making these sorts of decisions. Better site selection. So going back to my thing about willy-nilly choice of office space and how it's been for a long time, when you have data that can back up like where listings are coming from and where agents live. So that's another thing too. I also understand that we're going to get more data on the actual agents themselves, other than just what their MLS ID and their name and their office information is. When you get more of that information, especially on your own agents, because a lot of time you guys have home addresses, and sometimes brokerages don't even have home addresses. Even on independent contractor agreements, they may just put in their name and some basic information, but not add an address. So I don't know where my agents live. Also, how many brokerages update their independent contractor agreements, right? So if you know, what happens is you generally join a brokerage, you sign a document, and then you never sign an updated document to that unless there's something that happens down the road. So you guys as MLSs oftentimes know that an agent has moved before the brokerage knows about that information, or if they ever know about the information. So if you can pass where agents live to us and their actual home addresses, things like that, brokerages can start making better decisions based upon where agents are moving, where they live. They can also use listing data to better understand that as well, to say, look, I need to put an office here because it's seemingly that we're starting to get more listings in this area, so it might make a good decision to do that. Let's explore it. Let's look at the data a little further. Let's not just make a decision based upon what I think in my heart that I should do, right? The other thing about that information that MLSs can provide better data on is in aggregate. Right? So I know many of the tools that are out there, I can go in and pull hot sheets and I can pull value on how many listings have been added here, what the average price increase has been. But if you could make those things easier for brokerages to go take a look at, they can start identifying this is the new up and coming area, right? Maybe I should go put an office here because it looks like while it's been a dilapidated, not great area so far, they just put a Starbucks in. They just put in or they're thinking about putting in a Whole Foods, and the data is starting to show that prices are picking up there. It might make more sense to have the brokerage know that they can put an office there. Now, some of you might say, well, we have that data, but I will suggest a lot of the tools that are out there, a lot of what's baked in MLSs, don't make it really clear to find trends. So if your MLS has a tool that can provide those trends, maybe reframe the conversation about trends not just being about market data that the agent can hand to their clients, but maybe frame that to your brokerages to provide more value as how I can provide you information on what's going on in the market so you can make better decisions about the brokerage. Agent production data. We talked about this just a little bit. Look at sold transactions, find some outliers. I'm going to go through that one. So commissions. This conversation has come up big in the past couple weeks, right? So if you don't know, Redfin announced that they're going to, at least in the Seattle market, they're going to start displaying the buyer's agent side of the commission on the front-facing side of the website. I think this is in both, it's really two things. Number one is Redfin always is trying to be very forthright and consumer friendly and try to give them all the information, right? But also there's these lawsuits that are going on where consumers have sued the National Association of Realtors. They've sued all these different brokerages saying that they've conspired to try to keep commissions paid by the seller, and which has inflated what buyers actually end up paying for the property. By displaying what everything is and being fully transparent with it, I think they're feeling that that's going to help get around those sorts of issues. So if you can expose that information into your data set, or at least start considering and start having that conversation, it doesn't necessarily need to be displayed forthright on the website like what Redfin has chosen to do, but it can at least provide that data inside of the MLS so brokers can start looking at things and figuring out, based upon pulling in data into their business intelligence tools, to say, does it look like we are doing these sorts of things? Does it look like we should be following a better policy for this? Or do any of our agents never show any property that's listed with a buyer's compensation of less than 2.7%? If you have 500 listings that you've sold in the past 3 years or 5 years or whatever it happens to be, and you've never ever once done a deal where the buyer's commission offer was less than 3% or 3.125%, there might be something to look at there that the brokerage should take a peek at. But it also helps brokers track what's profitable, what's not, what is bringing in the door to an agent. You would be surprised at how little data most brokerages have on how actual profitable each individual agent is. So the more data you can expose, even when it comes to commissions, which I know is something that a lot of MLSs really hold dearly and close, but if you can provide that, it might help the broker make better decisions. And by the way, I'm going to step back for just a second, and I know I only have a couple minutes left here, but a lot of what I'm suggesting here, I'm not necessarily saying needs to go to every single vendor that's out there. I think this is where you look at, I think it was Sam, it was with you that I was having the good actor, bad actor conversation with yesterday, right? So find vendors that have shown and proven themselves to be good actors and are there to help brokerages, or push it through VOW feeds instead of just regular IDX feeds. Or maybe have a different standard that's above VOW that you can provide all of the data set to really empower brokerages, that those vendors that work with that data or the actual broker themselves is not going to put publicly, but they can use it for their own internal tools. So maybe it's not VOW, maybe it's a different standard above VOW for the vendor or the brokerage to work with. Just something to consider. Management reporting, I'm going to go kind of fast because I'm short on time. Management reporting, something else to help them consider is following up. Anybody know what NPS is? Net Promoter Score? Yes, yeah, a couple of you? Okay, so something else to help brokers with is really following up and figuring out if their agents are doing a good job without, and I'm not suggesting that it needs to be front-facing, but brokers a lot of times don't get the data on who the person that purchased the home is. And so if you're a brokerage, I would encourage you to start collecting that information and requiring agents to give it. If you're an MLS, it's possible you can collect that information and figure out who the buyer is. Also, how many, I love a hand raise, how many of you mandatory require the listing agent to enter who the buyer's agent was in your MLS upon closing? Most of you. Okay, how many of you push that data through your MLS feed or your IDX/VOW feed? A lot less hands are up than they were a second ago, right? So what happens with vendors like us is we can't help the broker make better decisions. We can't help them display and show them who actually represented transactions, because half of all transactions we don't get the data to, right? We know who the listing agent is. We rarely from MLSs get who the buyer's agent was. It almost never comes through the feed. We have over 200 MLSs that we pull in data feeds from, and I would say less than 20 pass through the feed who the buyer's agent is. So if you could pass that to us, then the broker can know more about it from a recruiting standpoint, and this always comes up, and maybe this is part of the reason why you're not doing it, but from a recruiting standpoint, wouldn't the broker want to know that Jane at XYZ Brokerage has done 20 deals this year with your brokerage on the opposite side, and she's not an agent there? If a brokerage can get access to that data, they may be able to do a better job recruiting, right? Skipping a little bit here. Help brokers better understanding. So MLSs, you guys can do a better job of providing just general aggregate data. I know I've mentioned this a couple times, but an MLS a couple years ago did a study, and they found in their MLS that 30 homes with pro photos, as opposed to an agent taking it on their iPhone, homes with those sell 32% faster. But imagine if you actually aggregated the data, or if you at least gave the data to the brokerages to make those better understanding in their system. Imagine what more that you could discern from your MLS that you don't know, that you could help your brokers with by making better decisions, right? And better photos in your MLS make better decisions for or make your MLS better as a whole, because if you have a front-facing website or something like that, more people are going to visit it if they have better photos and virtual tours and everything. So the last thing I'll leave you with here is to track everything. So if you're an MLS or if you're a brokerage sitting in this room, there's no reason anymore in 2019 to not track every single thing that's going on. At TRIBUS, literally every login, every change of a record, every price change, every status change, every single thing we track as a record, because there may be something that broker wants to do with it, and we provide a data warehouse system that allows them to make calls to say, look, I want to figure out how many times we change prices on the property on average. Our system allows for that. MLSs, you should be able to have that kind of data too, and you should be able to track every single thing that happens in your system and expose that better to brokerages. I think that's my time. So I will be around as always. If you guys have any other questions, if any other MLSs want to ask me a question or two or understand a little bit better about what we deal with or brokerage deals with, I'd love to answer them. Thanks a lot.